Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm actually going to be doing a video on how I create some watercolor effects, and I get quite a lot of questions on how I do a lot of my watercolor effects, so I thought I would do a video on the different effects that I do and my most used effects from my watercolor paintings. And if you are new around here and you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to my channel because it really does help my channel out. And if you want to stay updated with all of my uploads and get notified of when I upload a video, then make sure that you hit the bell icon as well, and then you'll get an update or a notification when I upload a video. But anyway, let's just jump into this video and I'm just going to talk through some of my effects. Now, I love creating a lot of watercolor effects because I feel like it adds a lot more to a painting, and I really enjoy just experimenting with lots of different effects. And if you are a beginner, then actually taking some time to experiment with these different effects might be quite useful for you because you're going to get an idea of how to create certain effects, and hopefully this video will help you with creating some of those effects. And you don't actually need to use specific materials for this, just grab a set of watercolor paints and some paintbrushes, and I also have 2 pots of water with me as well just to keep my paintbrushes cleaner for longer. And I'm just ready to get started, and I would recommend just using some watercolor paper because it is the right thickness and absorbency for watercolor. I'd also just recommend taping your piece of paper down to your surface just so that you don't get any warping or buckling of your paper. So the first technique that I wanted to talk you through was the wet on wet technique, and this is a very popular technique for a lot of artists to use because it's so simple yet so effective, and you can get some really nice results. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm just taking my paintbrush and I'm creating a clear wash of water, and I'm just wetting down the surface of the paper. Now, it's really important that you don't drown the paper in water because you don't want to create puddles. You just want to lightly glaze over the paper with some water. And then I'm just taking some watercolor from my paint palette and I'm literally just dropping this on the paper, and because the surface of the paper is wet, you're going to get these colors just gently bleeding and mixing into each other, and it's a great way for creating really nice, pretty, bold backgrounds. I will use this technique a lot in my watercolor paintings to create a lot of floral designs, and if I'm doing a lot of texture in my backgrounds, so for example if I'm painting flowers or foliage or trees, I'll use this technique quite a lot because it's so simple yet it gives that really nice textured result. And the more colours that you add in, the more brighter those colours are going to be, and as the paper starts to dry, the colours will bleed less into the surrounding areas, so you'll get some nice bolder colours. The next technique that we're going to be doing is using a spray bottle and sort of creating a sort of mist in our background. So the first thing that I'm doing is I am just creating a wash of colour, so I'm just glazing the paint over the paper just ever so slightly and gently, and I'm just using a little bit of water to help me move the colour along the paper. I'm just really softly creating that pinkish reddish background and just lightly glazing this over the paper. And then as it starts to dry, I'm just taking my mist spray bottle and I'm creating sort of specks of patterns in the background just by spraying with the spray bottle. Now you can actually grab one of these from a travel kit, so I just got one of these from like a travel kit and I just filled it up with plain water, and then I just lightly sprayed this over the background and it just creates little white specks. The next effect that I'm going to do is using some gouache paint alongside my watercolours, and I just use this brand. It's the Winsor & Newton designer gouache and it's a white gouache paint, and I'm going to be using this in combination with my watercolours. Now gouache can be used and is archival with watercolours, and I'll use gouache all the time with watercolour. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to take some purple from my paint palette and I'm just going to gently glide this over my paper. And I'm using a mix of watercolour with a little bit of water, so the paper is slightly wet. Now you can obviously use any colours that you want for this effect, so you don't have to use purple, you can use any combination of colour that you want. But as the paper is still wet, I'm going to take some designer gouache paint and I'm just going to make a sort of milky like texture, and I'm just going to mix it in with some water. And then all I'm doing is just dropping this into the already wet purple paint, and it's going to create a sort of like bleeding spidery effect. And this is a really beautiful effect that I use, very simple but really effective, and I use this all the time for my backgrounds. The other thing that I like about gouache as well is that you can see that it does go slightly opaque as well, and also slightly translucent in areas, and it just looks really pretty, and this sort of result would look really good for a frosted window or snow. Next I'm taking a dry sponge, and this is just like a sponge on a stick that I have, but you can use any sponge, and this is to create a lot of texture in my backgrounds, and this is an effect that I use all the time for getting that effect. I literally just dab my sponge into my paint, and I just pick up a little bit of paint on the tip of the sponge, but you might find that you want to wet down the sponge and do it that way. And then all I'm doing is just gently dabbing this onto my paper. Now this is really good if you're creating trees or you're creating a lot of hedges, plants, foliage, because it creates that texture that you see in those plants and trees. And I'm just adding a little bit of blue in there as well, so again you can mix any colours that you want to create this effect. I also like to stroke this sponge as well, just to create a sort of more scratchier texture as well. And then I also dab the tip of the sponge as well. And I'm just really experimenting with lots of different textures with a sponge, and a sponge is great for this type of thing. Next we're going to be using some bubble wrap, and again this is a technique that I use all the time. And what I like to do is just take a little bit of bubble wrap, so I'm just going to cut a small section of this bubble wrap off my roll of bubble wrap, and I'm just using a pair of scissors just to cut a small section off. Once I've cut the section of bubble wrap off, all I'm going to do is start to create the effect. Now I'm actually going to be creating two effects with the bubble wrap. So the first is where I'm going to be creating a slight wash of blue onto the paper, and I'm just taking the paintbrush and just putting this blue paint on the paper. And as the paper is still wet, I'm just taking a bit of my bubble wrap and I'm just going to place it just over the top of the paint. I'm just pressing down very slightly, and what it's going to do is it's going to create the bubble wrap texture on your painting. I also do this technique and paint directly onto the bubble wrap. So I'm just taking some watercolor and I'm just directly creating the effect by painting onto the bubble wrap, and this is going to create like a sort of water droplet effect in your backgrounds. So you can see how it's just slightly covering over the bubble wrap. And then once I've painted onto the bubble wrap, I'm just going to literally just turn it over and press it down on the paper really gently. And then as you lift the bubble wrap, it's going to create those sort of water droplets, and as you can see it's created these sort of circles on the second piece of paper as well. And here you can see just some of the results from my watercolor effects, and these are watercolor effects that I use all the time in my watercolor paintings. So I hope that you did enjoy this video. I am going to be having another video coming out very soon where I'm going to be including a lot more watercolor effects, but I really hope that you did enjoy this one and how I get some of my results and effects with watercolor. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you are new around here, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video. Keep creating guys, and I'll see you soon. Bye!